My name is Susanna Cooper. I'm moderating this session. I'm really delighted to be here. Could I see a show of hands for those who were in part one of the early childhood? Almost everybody. Okay. Which means I'm going to truncate my introductions significantly because these three fine panelists have already been introduced. So just to make sure you know you're in the right place, this is Early Learning for Children with Disabilities, Pre-K Alignment, and Early Childcare Data Systems. We have with us Deborah Stipek, who is Judy Koch Professor of Education and the Peter Haas Faculty Director at the Haas Center for Public Service at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford, where she is also the former dean. She has been so influential for so many of us who have worked around early childhood policy in California. And I want to say I've been reading her work for about 20 years, which I think dates both of us. From time spent as a journalist to working at the Public Policy Institute to being an advocate around early childhood issues and then working in the state legislature, she was really a go-to person for evidence around early childhood. She's joined by Beth Milloy, who is a senior researcher at LPI and policy analyst as well at LPI, where she co-leads the early learning team. She recently authored LPI's report, Building an Early Learning System That Works, Next Steps for California. And also by Marjorie Wexler, who is Principal Research Manager at LPI. Marjorie studies the ECE landscape in California and other states across the country and was lead author on a recently published book titled The Road to High Quality Early Learning, Lessons from the States. So I think we're going to dive right in with a presentation that Deborah is going to launch. And then we'll move from there to what I expect will be lively and assertive questions from the group. Okay, they told me how to get out of this. We can go back to that if people are interested. Is that right? No? How do I get to that? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Actually, I've been working in the field of early childhood education for 40-some years, which just tells you how much older I am than Suzanne. So these are the topics of the various chapters in the Getting Down to Facts section focused on early childhood education, and we discussed 4 of them that are not bolded this morning. We're gonna discuss the other 3 this afternoon, and for the benefit of the 2 or 3 people here who were not here this morning, I just want to reiterate that we are fully aware that the knowledge and experience and expertise in this room is extremely impressive. We are humbled by that, and so we are here to basically share some of the highlights of the findings, but they won't be a big surprise to most of you because you're working in this field, and we present them almost as much really as conversation starters, to get a conversation with you all going about some of these issues. I think one of the benefits of Getting Down to Facts is it's got people in the room together who care about issues, who can engage, and who don't necessarily engage because although all of us kind of connect with one or the other person, we don't have an opportunity to sit in a room together with people with such diverse experiences and expertise. So we want to take good advantage of that. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about children with disabilities and what the state of the state is in terms of serving young children with disability, the needs of young children with disabilities. I think with complete honesty, this is not a topic that I have ever done work in or that I have much expertise in. I'm hoping there are some folks in the room who will be able to answer questions if they come up in the conversation. So I'm just going to give you a few introductory comments about some of the things that I learned actually in working on this project. The Individuals with Disabilities Act, I'm sure all of you are familiar with it. I guess I should get to it. Is designed really to focus, to ensure that states are paying attention and meeting the needs of children with disabilities. we are required to provide services to children who are age 3 and above. We are encouraged to provide services for infants and toddlers. As in many of the other topics that we've discussed, actually I think probably just about anywhere in conversations about early childhood in the state of California, you have an incredible amount of fragmentation in oversight, and that can be confusing both to families and also create some inefficiencies. So, for example, both the Department of Developmental Services and the Department of Education are deeply involved in meeting the needs of disabled children, but they're quite distinct from each other, and some reports that have been done, such as the statewide Special Education Task Force, noted that there are a lot of inefficiencies that are the result of these two different streams, two different agencies. And a recent LAO report actually recommended that these programs be consolidated to some degree, and that they're overseen by a single agency rather than two. One of the biggest problems is that infants and toddlers are not screened at the level that they should be. So one thing that really struck me, I saw a table with children by category who had been diagnosed with a particular disability for 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 5-year-olds. And one of the things that struck me was that there were 95 children who were 2-year-olds who had been identified as on the autism spectrum. At 3, there were nearly 5,000. Now, I don't think that something happened between the age of 2 and 3, and we know that we can diagnose autism usually by 18 months, certainly by 2 years. So those are children who did not have an opportunity to receive services early in their lives, and we also know from the research that the earlier children receive services, the better their outcomes. And so in some regards, whatever we saved by not doing efficient, effective screening, we paid later on in having to make up for the later intervention. There have been a lot of explanations for the fact that many children, young children, are not screened. One is that not everybody goes to a well-child visit, and that's where we pretty much depend on screening. Pediatricians' lack of time, they're often very hurried. They are not necessarily well trained to do screenings. They often rely on their own clinical impressions rather than on a validated screening tool. And the reimbursement formulas are too low. I can't elaborate on those because I'm relying on other people's research and don't know the field that well, but I think there are a number of things that need to be paid attention to with young children. One of the other problems is that California children are served at a fewer proportion of California children in every ethnic group are served than in most other states. So, you know, it's possible that we just have fewer children with disabilities, but I think most of us probably assume that there's something going on that is not necessarily meeting the needs of children. There's also a shortage of qualified early childhood special ed teachers. And so what has happened in special ed, similar to what happened in K-12 when we have had shortages of teachers, is they've essentially used emergency credentialing or allowed people to provide teaching that don't have the proper training. There's also a significant shortage of spaces for children with special needs in regular preschool programs. The general principle that we all understand is the least restrictive environment, and many children with special needs can thrive and do just fine in a regular preschool, but we just don't have enough slots. Head Start, for example, puts aside some percentage of slots for children with special needs. State pre-K in California doesn't. So many of them, a higher proportion than in most other states, end up in programs where they're isolated from their non-disabled peers. So those are the, this is the last thing. Then I read studies on parent satisfaction, and most of the studies of parent satisfaction find that they are fairly well satisfied with their regional and school-based services. Of course, these are the parents who actually get the services. So we don't know how many don't take the survey that don't get the services, but either parents are unaware that it could be better, or the services that they finally get are fine. It's just that there are a lot of kids who are not getting the services that they need. So I'm going to completely switch gears. We can come back to all of these topics after we've gone through them. So we're going to do kind of a quick run through to get the conversation going, and then we'll come back to these. So let me talk about another topic that I actually have done quite a bit of work in, and is becoming increasingly important, and more attention is being paid to it, which is the connections between pre-K and the early elementary grades. So one finding that is quite striking to me in a national study was that kindergarten teachers tended to teach substantially the same material that children had learned in pre-K. That there was very little association between the skills that children came from pre-K into kindergarten and the skills that they were actually taught, the nature of the instructional program. That's really concerning, because we know that children learn best when they're moving along a pathway and having opportunities to develop new skills. When they're retaught the same material, they're not gaining in their skills. It is, I think, probably a substantial explanation for fade out, because if you have pre-K kids going into kindergarten and the teacher is teaching the same thing that the pre-K kids learned already, then it's not really fade out, it's catch up. It's the kids who haven't gone to preschool or quality preschool who are catching up because they're getting the material for the first time and mastering it. Some people say, well, as long as they're, then we don't really need pre-K because they're all going to get the material sooner or later anyway, but they don't. And because we know that a very large proportion of kids by third grade are not on grade level, they're not mastering the standards. And also all those kids who got that head start on pre-K, which we hope someday all kids will have an opportunity to have, they're not continuing to develop their skills. So that's just one example of a disconnect between pre-K and the early elementary grades, which is not benefiting children. So we've done a lot of work where we've interviewed people in districts about what they're doing. And it turns out there are a lot of districts in California that are really working hard to try to create greater linkages, greater synergy between their preschool programs. One of the things that they're doing is they're devoting some of their own resources to pre-K and using LCFF funds. Some of them are using Title I funds. Oh, sorry, I'm actually on the wrong slide here. Well, you all know this. Pre-K and TK are like, TK-12 are like two different worlds. Just different funding sources, different amounts, different management, different standards. They're just like completely two different worlds. So now I'll get up to what I was talking about. Oh, no, actually, I'm sorry for my disorganization here. I did want to mention something about culture and beliefs, which we got into a little bit this morning. They are two different worlds, and we think of these things as things that we can fix from some kind of a management way or a policy way, but they're also two different worlds in terms of culture and beliefs about how children learn, what is effective, learning experiences for children, what is important about learning. And I think those differences in culture and beliefs are in some respects the most challenging for creating continuity between pre-K and kindergarten. Preschool teachers, most of them care deeply about social emotional development. They talk about the whole child. We got into this a little bit this morning. K-12 is more oriented toward academic achievement, and And so when you put pre-K and even K teachers together, they're under very different incentive systems and different beliefs about what's appropriate. So the pre-K teachers are very resistant to teaching or instruction, and the kindergarten teachers see themselves primarily as instructional and not so much focused on the whole child and that sort of thing. Things like involving parents. You get pre-K teachers are much more, embrace much more the idea that parents are their partners and they should work closely with parents. Once kids get into K-12, that breaks down a bit in many schools. And so one of the things we're going to need to do, in addition to deal with the management and standards and teacher preparation and things like that that get in the way of connecting these two worlds, is think about ways to educate elementary teachers in some of the thinking of and belief systems of the pre-K teachers, and also help the pre-K teachers understand that there are ways, understand and learn how, to be able to promote children's learning, even in academic areas, in a way that is child-friendly, that is fun, and developmentally appropriate. So some of the things that the districts have done to try to create greater alignment, expanding access to pre-K, as I mentioned before, co-locating pre-K on the elementary school. It's really difficult to create connections and collaborations and communication if you've got 13 different pre-Ks that are feeding into your kindergarten, but if you have one on the campus, that certainly helps. Although I gotta say, it doesn't guarantee it, because we were in one school and the teacher said, "Oh, there's a pre-K on campus." So it doesn't always create strong linkages in and of itself. Administering pre-K through the district, actually about 2/3 of state pre-Ks are administered through the districts, but it's often basically subcontracted, and so the district is not that deeply involved in the management of the pre-K. We talked about this morning, placing the pre-K under the elementary school principal. And it makes sense, doesn't it? If you have one person who's responsible for pre-K through the early grades, you're going to have more consistent policies and more opportunities for alignment and continuity. But there are schools that we have found where the principal felt so insecure or uncomfortable with overseeing the pre-K that instead of the pre-K getting better aligned, the pre-K was kind of the forgotten stepchild. So they had no director who was advocating and supporting the teachers, and the principal was not necessarily advocating for them and supporting the principals. So one of the things that we've learned is that none of these things in and of themselves is going to solve the problem. You can put a pre-K on the elementary campus. It doesn't mean that there's any connections between them. You can put the principal, the elementary principal over the pre-K. Doesn't mean that they're actually supporting or creating greater continuity. There's a lot more that has to be done. Some school districts have actually created their own continuous curricula that starts in pre-K and moves up through the early elementary grades, as well as assessments. There are a number of districts that have provided professional development for pre-K teachers with early elementary school teachers. This may be one of the most important things to do. We'll talk about how difficult it is in a minute, but if you're a kindergarten teacher, you're going to have children in your class who have not yet met the California Foundations for 4-year-olds, the expectations for 4-year-olds. You also may have some children who are actually reading at the first grade reading level. So you've got this range of kids in your classrooms, but kindergarten teachers are taught, trained, and encouraged to teach the kindergarten curriculum, as opposed to you've got kids who are all over the place. So you need to teach the kids, use the curriculum as a basis for teaching them, but you really need to know where your kids are. You need to know what children are supposed to learn when they're 4, and what kinds of strategies work for children who are working at the skill level of a typical 4-year-old. You also need to know what children need to learn and what's expected of them when they're 6, because you're going to have some children who should be working at that level. So teachers at any level really need to know a lot about what's going on and the expectations and the strategies for teaching children who are younger and older. Combining teachers together in PD can really make that, that's a very effective tool for doing that, making them aware of the different standards and the different expectations and the different strategies that can be used for children at different age levels, or I should say different skill levels, and that's true for social emotional issues as well, self-regulation and that sort of thing. Some kindergarten teachers have kids who have very poor self-regulation, despite some of them having gone to pre-K. So it just requires them seeing early childhood not as 5-year-olds and then 6-year-olds, but as a continuum, a developmental continuum, and any group of children they're teaching is on that continuum. We need to provide, we talked about this morning, that many principals had not had any ECE training. But there are districts that have providing that. So Fresno, for example, has an incredibly good program that's designed to teach their elementary school principals about young children and what their needs are. And as I mentioned this morning, some of them are seeing the benefits of taking some of those beliefs from early childhood and applying them in kindergarten, first, second, and even third grade. Here are the challenges that they have shared with us. Underfunding, we've talked about that. Imagine being a school district person who is trying to provide pre-K in their district, but is braiding sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 different funding strands, which come with different accountability requirements. Incredibly complicated and an incredible waste of staff time, because they're having to spend some, and a small rural district can't do this because they can't devote a whole staff member or a whole group of staff members who spend all of their time just navigating these different funding sources and standards and requirements. The joint professional development is difficult because, one, there's differences in the training between the pre-K and the kindergarten TK first grade teachers. So if you're trying to teach a group of teachers how to improve children's math skills, one group has never taught math, has never learned to teach math. Another has, but could use some opportunities to grow in that area. It's difficult. You've got 2 very different groups often that you're combining because of the differences. They have different schedules. Pre-K teachers don't have time off. I mean, again, I never thought I'd think that TK-12 was like what we strive for, but they do get a little time for PD. And then those cultural beliefs and that I mentioned before. There are very few curricula in this country that go pre-K through the elementary grades. There's the pre-K curricula and assessments, and then there are the kindergarten through the early elementary grade. And I'm hoping that we'll see some more soon. We don't have any state assessments that we give pre-K through the early grades. We've talked, and we're going to talk more about data in a minute, but to collect data, you have to have data to collect, and we don't provide assessments. So I think to some degree, the problem with the kindergarten teachers reteaching what children already know is that they don't have meaningful assessment data that they can use so that by day 1, they can have thought through their curriculum instructional program for the kids who are walking in the door of their curriculum. And we've talked about the principals being prepared to take on early childhood. So those are some of the things that we've learned up and down the state, having conversations with people in the districts. I think there's a lot of interest among districts to do more. There are some ways in which the state is making it difficult, and there are some ways in which districts could just be supported and given some general guidelines and principles about what's worked in other districts. And now we're going to go on to data, because data will help all of these issues.
Yes, I know. Everyone's like, ooh, data exciting. Or at least if you're a researcher, you're like, data exciting. But I do think it really, apart from money, which we talked about this morning, and I'm sure we'll come back to, the lack of data on early learning systems across the country, but especially in California where things are so fragmented and we don't have a centralized attempt at data even, really drives our inability to improve, for parents to have access, et cetera. So I'm going to go through a couple of the impacts of our lack of data on families, on providers, and then, of course, on decision makers. So parents generally lack access to information about their own eligibility for public subsidies, programs that are available to meet their needs. So if they have, especially if they have alternate work schedules or they're working on the weekends, but even just if they're trying to fill a normal day plus commute, finding care that actually provides 10 hours or more of access a day is really difficult. And then also the quality of those available programs. So we talked this morning, and I'm sure we'll talk some more about sort of all of the pieces of our current system that are working really hard to help parents have this information, right? We have, I don't know why that happened. We have the resource and referral networks that are really working hard both to ensure that parents know what they're eligible for, know when care services are available, and know the quality information that's out there. We have the quality rating improvement systems working hard to create a system through which parents can start to understand quality and where their program may or may not fall on that spectrum. But, those efforts tend to be siloed or fragmented or just incomplete and underfunded. We also have significant impact on providers. So providers really lack the information and tools that they need to find children to fill slots, and also with our state contracting system in particular, to predict how many kids there are going to be in their area for a given year that are going to need access to the kind of services that they're providing, so they know how many children they think they're going to serve, so that then they can fulfill their contract, but they don't under or overestimate and then create problems for the next year. They generally lack the information that they need to improve their own quality. So even providers that are very invested in providing high quality early learning, which one could say could be all of our providers, it keeps doing that. They really lack the information that they need to make the decisions about improving their own quality. They have a curriculum, but if they don't have a way of measuring whether or not that curriculum is effectively supporting their teachers to provide the kind of instruction that kids need to master the skills they need, then they don't know whether or not they need to change their curriculum, or do they need to layer something on top of that curriculum to focus on math or social emotional learning. They really just lack the data, and they also, if they are collecting data, they tend to lack the expertise they might need to use it effectively, right? So as a researcher, I can say, well, you would do this, this, and that. But early learning providers who are focused on the actual practice and service provision don't necessarily have the skills or the tools that they need to actually do that and then know the so what of it. And then, yes, so I sort of made this point both about improving the overall quality, but as Deborah pointed out, we lack really high quality assessments for children. The DRDP provides some information. It's incredibly complex. It takes a lot of time that we just mentioned teachers and early educators don't have in order to sort of go through that assessment. But then teachers really lack the preparation, the training, the support that they need to know the so what of that as well. So what do you do with that information? How do you use that information to think about how you're engaging with a particular child or the kinds of activities that you're planning for your whole group? And they just really lack the information and the support to be able to do that. And then finally, for me, the most sort of exciting aspect of data, if we were to actually get some, is that I want to point out the Herculean effort that Deborah undertook in putting together this massive document, because there is no one place to go for this information. There are maybe 20, and then you're left thinking, I must have missed something because my picture is so incomplete. So when you're a policymaker, a decision maker, and you want to invest in early childhood, you know that young children need high quality learning experiences, but you lack basic information about the kinds of services that they're getting, about the kinds of services that parents need, when the data that are available are completely fragmented by the program, again, that may be funding it, or by children's age, or by a particular region, where you have one region that's doing a really good job and has put local resources into collecting data, and then you go to another part of the state and you know nothing. And then I think we highlighted really well in the last session this morning that, hopefully we're on the precipice in this state of a really significant investment in our early learning system. But it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And so if we want to be able to make the incremental progress that's necessary to get to a better system that actually provides access to high quality early learning opportunities for all children, we have to be able to measure the impact of the incremental investments that are put into the system. So what are we able to buy, and how much further do we need to go are just natural, logical questions that as a policymaker you may not wish to continue putting money into something if you can't see what the money you've already put into it is getting you. So that is all for now.
So join me in thanking Deborah and Beth and Marjorie for the work. I was supposed to do a sum up of what they told us, but I feel like I want to do something that's more developmentally appropriate for this group. Because I'm looking around and this is like old home week for me, and there is so much expertise in this room from LAO, from the data guru from Children Now, from the Linked Learning Alliance, from First Five, CDE, Kidango, Early Edge, the California Teachers Association, the Early Learning Lab. I mean, we've got philanthropy, we've got it all. We've got advocacy. So I want to really encourage people to jump in and ask some questions. Maybe I'll just throw out kind of an existential one that's really been bothering me since I read this report, which I'm so grateful for because it's like having a book, each chapter. And yes, I'm reading it and I'm thinking, God, are we really still talking about these things? But yes, we are, and it's important to have it all collected in one place. But what I was going to say, Deborah, that in particular, I appreciated that while you were cold and you went for just the facts, there was a thread of deep irritation. And I got it. It's in there, and it's, you might even find it in some of the footnotes. So my question is, you make such a great case for why it is that we need to start paying attention to these things and investing significantly upfront if we don't want to just keep paying for it later, which is what we do. So what is it that we have to do, and this is as much a question for all of you as it is for the panel, to convince decision makers that we need to make significant investments upfront, whether it's in data or screening or, go on down, all the things that we've talked about today and in session one. And I'll let whichever one of you wants to start, and then I want to throw it open to the group.
I'd actually like to hear, there are people in this room who are advocates who have spent many years working on that problem, which is how do you convince policymakers? So I'd really like to hear what they've learned as the most convincing or effective strategies.
So give me a volunteer, or I will use the Harvard Business School method, which is, come on, Scott. Oh, Nina, good, she saved you.
You're welcome. I think a lot of us advocates, we'll use any argument that we need to use in order to get the message across, right? So whether it's like job creation, whether it's preventing incarceration, whether it's, early identification to help save you at the end of the day, right? But the common theme with that is data, like you guys are talking about. And I think that, really from my perspective, we've hit our head against the wall without having accurate data. And whether you really buy into the unique child identifier, whether you don't, we need something to actually prove, what are the outcomes that we're giving you? This is every amount of this much money serves this many children. It gives this type of quality activity. We need these enhancements because of this. And it just seems to me without that data system, we're continually never going to get enough money because we can't show some of the outcomes. I mean, I know a lot of the cost modeling has gone on these days. I know, some numbers range from like $10 billion to like $24 billion to make the system be what it is. And we need to have some really good data to phase up to an additional $24 billion, right? So, I mean, for me, that really seems a lot of it. And it's also ensuring sort of this continuum and understanding where is the quality, where are these levers, where are these assessments when we do grapple with this pre-K, 0 to 3, and TK world.
Yeah. Nice. How about over here?
So I would kind of piggyback on that because I think the data is absolutely necessary. No decision maker or policymaker is going to champion an issue without the data to back it up pretty robustly. But one of the things that I've seen, and I work for United Way of California, is also getting to know, like doing the relationship mapping and getting to know the policy and decision makers that you are wanting to target, and understanding sort of what their internal motivation is as well. And so, we've got some of the strongest leaders who have had personal experience. So being able to tie it to the heartstring component, to that thing that like, oh, my kid is now 3 years old and I'm trying to navigate this system that I had no idea was so complicated. Advocates, what do we do? And then as long as the advocates can come to the table and say, here's our 10 recommendations for the next 10 years, and here's the data to back it up, then that gives that individual a platform. I think that's really powerful.
Nice. Phil?
I just want to build up that because I think we're looking at it. I think we should be looking at it in a totally different way than we've ever looked at it before, which is to say we've used to have this like, okay, what are the arguments we need to come up with, and whatever argument's going to make, we're going to make that argument. And I think we're about to enter, barring, flood, famine, a leader in the state for whom this is his #1 priority. And he's already made that perfectly clear. So it really comes back to a question that we no longer have to convince policymakers that this is the right thing to do. But as advocates and service providers and people who believe in this, it's incumbent upon us, to your 10-year point, about what does this 10-year roadmap look like so that we have the data so that we can look at it. Because I think we have to turn around our thinking. Because we've just been so used to like fighting for what's the crumb of the cookie that we're actually all going to fight over for this next thing, because we've been fighting forever for just that crumb. And we actually have to believe now that we're actually going to get the whole cookie. Just to draw this analogy. So the governor's putting the cookie on the table, and it's actually up to us so that we look back 10 years from now on this time and say, this worked, and this had an impact. And I think we have a completely different set of responsibilities on our plate than we ever had.
Let me add, can I add to the cookie? So we got to buy the cookie too. And which means we got to raise the money for the cookie, which is
right. But here's where we, because you and I did this work years ago. Let me just say something completely arrogant. It's not up to us to figure out how to pay for it. I leave that to the Department of Finance. I leave that to others. Because if we start, because we had this, that's why we did the Writer Initiative, because we didn't want to have losers. If we're the ones who are trying to figure out how to pay for it, we're going to make enemies. We just have to present it as, look, K-12 system is not delivering what it needs to for kids in this state. We need to invest in preschool. We need to invest in early ed. We need to invest in 0 to 3. I've never said that before. And you guys go figure out how to pay for it, but here's what we need, and here's the timeline that we think we should roll it out.
But I think we also, just to keep with the cookies, don't want to put all our cookies in the governor's basket, because there are a lot of other people who are going to have to support, And I just want to mention two arguments that I find people to be receptive to and to say, wow, I didn't realize that. One is the neuroscience, which actually really annoys me because we have had evidence from social science for many years that quality childcare has long-term benefits. But it wasn't until they can show policymakers a brain that they started taking it seriously. But they do take it seriously. And I think the neuroscience now is very, very strong on not only the amount of development that occurs in those first 5 years, but how important experience is. The other finding, frankly, is from getting down to facts, too, which is Sean Reardon's finding that the disproportion the very high achievement gap that California has relative to other states is mostly explained by the achievement gap that we have when children enter kindergarten. So if we are serious about the achievement gap, then we do need to think about what we're doing for children and the ways in which we're investing and supporting them in those early years. And that I have found to resonate quite a bit.
Yep. I think I saw, okay, go ahead. And then I think I saw Camille in the back raising her hand back there. No? Go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to add one more thing that I think we need as sort of a field is to see everyone in this room and everyone in that other room as partners in this, right? So we have been, right, so used to fighting over the one crumb that our individual constituencies or passions sort of are at odds with one another, and they don't need to be. There's nothing about children when they turn 5 that suddenly makes me care less about them. And there's nothing about their development that changes either, right? And so I think both the ECE and K-12 worlds coming together and saying, like, investments, and the research is there to support this, investments in K-12 and in early learning together are the only thing that has the potential to solve our achievement gap problem. Investments in one may or may not be more fruitful than the other, but the research is there that if you invest in just early childhood but not in K-12, you're going to see fade out, you're going to see issues. It's not going to get you there. If you invest just in K-12, kids come into the school with these huge gaps and they can't ever catch up. And so you really have to invest in both. And then that's also, the same things 0 to 3 and 4-year-olds. Nothing special happens really between 3 and 4. That's the way we separate folks out. And so seeing our issues as one and coming up with a plan where everyone can see themselves in it and get behind it and trust that we're going to get to the whole cookie, even if your slice isn't the very first slice.
We may be talking about a cake by now.
Pie, I don't know. There were eggs earlier.
Who else? Does anybody want to take it to a separate question or another thread? Yes, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Maeva. I'm a fellow with Leadership for Educational Equity. I just came out of the classroom and I taught pre-K, I taught kindergarten, first, second, and I also taught a group of students from the ages of 12 to 17 who were diverse learners. And so I'm here to really learn about how I can advocate more for the disconnect I recognize from pre-K to students who are on a transitional plan to adulthood. When I went into the pre-K classroom, I was the only, you guys say, I'm from Florida and I taught in New York, and so we don't use the word credential, just certified teacher. So I was the only certified teacher in my pre-K program, and I was brought in to help make the school more inclusive. And a lot of what I heard from my colleagues was that we don't know what to do, so we're happy that you're here. We need to know how to best support the students that are coming in who have special needs. And so what I'm recognizing is that there is a disconnect as far to differentiated instruction for students. And also, when I was teaching kindergarten and first grade, I had to go back to the content from preschool for most of my students. And so I wonder, how do we this alignment that you were talking about, how I want to learn how to best advocate for that and how to make sure that it's implemented. And so I really want to hear from the researchers and the wealth of knowledge here, on how to best do that.
Well, again, some of you may have specifically worked in districts or in places where you've tried to improve that kind of alignment. What's working?
Can I just, I'm also new, I'm learning, I'm an assistant superintendent of educational services, previously principal, and also elementary first grade teacher. And I can tell you, stepping out of my role of elementary principal to assistant soup, and figuring out where are my preschools? Is there a state preschool? Do we have Head Start? What is that? And that huge disconnect of all the classes I had to take, not knowing. In my case, my preschool sits with my special education director, which we have a good relationship. But part of that is just understanding and knowing, even though you think you can solve it, being able to, one, acknowledge, and I'm going to say even though we don't like the accountability piece, then we have to have some accountability. Even looking at our data, when our kids are coming in for preschool, what does that look like? So we're starting to do some of that work. So I can just say what's working, I think it's that knowledge, understanding, that advocacy piece. Something that heartstrings. Yeah. I do have a 2-year-old and a 21 and an 18-year-old now, so different place. But understanding what that landscape needs to look like and how can we support and help.
And which district are you?
Patterson Unified.
Patterson Unified, okay, yeah. Camille in the back.
I actually had a question for the panel. When you talk about, you're talking a lot about districts, where do county offices come in? Because I know a lot of county offices actually are the coordinators for their early development programs throughout their county. So did you all talk to county offices at all, or how did that work?
We did, and at least in the districts that we interviewed in some detail that were really doing some pretty interesting work in this area, the county offices sometimes they were the providers of the professional development, and so they would use their resources, but I didn't get examples of county office leadership in this sector. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means it just didn't come up. There are some districts, I think a lot of it has to do with the commitment of the district. The superintendent and people on down has to say, this is important. We own those children. We can't just wait till they walk in our door. Or they are actually overseeing in some management way, so they really own the children in some respects. Some of the districts told us that they had to do a lot of work with the principals to get them on board. But one of the things that we learned was you need to get a real genuine commitment and sign on that this is something that is worth our time and resources. Some of the districts, Long Beach, for example, actually went out into the community and found the Head Starts and the programs that were feeding their schools and created a kind of consortium among them. And when they did professional development, they invited these preschools to the professional development. So there were a lot of small things that kind of add up to a much better system and a much better sense of a community that feels an ownership of children, at least from 3 on, if not earlier on. But they also talked a lot about some of the things that they felt the state could do to make their job a little less difficult.
Okay, I've got Scott and then Jeff and who? Oh, Patricia behind you. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
So our experience, for those who don't know, Cadango is a large community-based child care preschool provider in the Bay Area. We have a lot of preschools on elementary school campuses, so we partner closely with school districts. And right now in East San Jose, in Allen Rock, and the Franklin McKinley districts, we've embarked on this effort, which essentially does this. We look at social emotional function, language, literacy, and math. We back map from 3rd grade where kids' skill levels need to be, all the way down to preschool. We should be going down to 0 to 3, but that's where we are. We then have curriculum that's aligned embedded coaching, and then assessments that are aligned, so that we can track student progress along the way and tailor instruction to that. That is, we're just building that now. Part of that is being researched or evaluated by Newark University of Chicago through an RCT. The first year results are encouraging, but that's the system that I think we're very hopeful about.
Thank you for sharing that. Jeff?
I'm sorry if this is already covered in the prior conversation, but I'm wondering if there are states or locales that have been highlighted as models that California can learn from.
On the issue of the alignment,
Alignment or more?
yes, North Carolina. Was it South Carolina?
North Carolina.
North Carolina. North Carolina.
Yes.
It has done, we actually did in the chapter on alignment, we do a little box of a case study where they did, most of it was at the district level, but the state also did a number of things, like create a consortium among people to advocate and work collaboratively on early ed issues, creating curriculum that went from pre-K into through the elementary grades, actually, that teachers were involved in creating. So they've really put a lot of emphasis into creating a system. And what's interesting about it is that their math and literacy scores, you look at the tables and they just go like this over the years that this was being done. So there are some good examples of making efforts. They're somewhat isolated. This was more of a district initiative that the state kind of got behind and supported. I don't know of whole states that have really, do you?
I think the pre-K alignment to K-12, when we looked at different states, that was, I think, the area that was furthest behind. There was a lot of recognition and a lot of movement towards creating better linkages. We did see, like in West Virginia, they were aligning their data system. So,
Yes.
I mean, we talked about a huge issue with data here in California, where they actually put they're collecting similar data starting from pre-K and K and not just, check boxes, but actually looking at some social emotional things and some other basic information about the children. So it's actually useful to track the children. It's useful for the kindergarten teachers to see where the pre-K, what they're coming in with. So I think there are definitely pockets.
Pennsylvania is another state, especially on the data end, that has, and I wanted to mention Pennsylvania because, and this goes to Camille's comment this morning about thinking about the whole child, and the best education setting can do a lot, but there's also issues of health and mental health and other kinds of resources, nutrition and things like that. And Pennsylvania and a few other places have tried to create cross-sector data, because a lot of the children that you're dealing with at the age of 3 they may have a disability, they may have a social worker, they may have a parent who's in jail, there are all kinds of things that are impacting that child's life, yet we tend to deal with children within our individual sectors. And I think it's an odd thing, but I think sometimes data actually drives policy in the sense that you become more aware of when kids go sort of off the wagon, so to speak, when you look at data and you find that they're not making any progress between the age of 5 and 6. Kindergarten seems not to be doing anything. So then it forces you to say, what's happening in kindergarten? Well, when you look under the hood, it turns out they're teaching the same thing the kids already learned. And so the data actually drove questions which then start pushing some policy and work to try to find solutions.
Can I add to that to say that I think data also has a lot of power in that building relationships piece, because I know I spent a little bit of time in the U.S. Senate, and I've used this example before because it's just so poignant to me, where you had advocates for homeless kids and advocates for foster care kids fighting one another for who deserved more education protection. When when you look at the data, these are the same kids at different points in their lives. Right? They're the same children. And so when you can really demonstrate that, and it's the kind of thing that we all sort of take for granted, but when you have data that shows, like, the kids that are in these subsidized childcare programs are the same kids who are trying to access the health insurance, and they're the same kids whose parents are getting food stamps and all of these pieces, then there's a lot of power in bringing people who have these the same core mission at heart, which is healthy families and children, together to see these are the same kids, and we can really, there are some efficiencies and also some just better services that can be provided when you come together.
I want to get to Patricia.
I have the same question, but I have another one. So, for the next governor, what would you do first? Pre-K through alignment. I mean, there's so much to do, like, data is huge, but that takes a long time to do. But he asked, where do we start? Like, what can I do to start this process of, having, because he's, it is out there, the P to 16 model, but how do we get there, and what do we do first to start the process, right?
That's the $64,000 question that I think all of us are grappling with, probably because there's such a pent-up, built-up desire to start moving in early childhood that we want to do it all at once. And I think that's absolutely right. We're going to have to be a little bit more self-disciplined in a way to help make priorities. I think we may give 3 different answers. So I will just mention a couple of things, and it's partly getting in the door and starting to build the infrastructures and build the capacities that are needed. One is on the data. I think we do need to get started on that. We're not going to be there maybe for 5 years or even longer. Other states that have done this have found that it takes a long time, but we've got to set some goals and get the process started and have some milestones. We should be here in 2 years and here in 5 years and so on. In terms of training, which is another area that I think quality has got to be a critical piece. If you look at the research on the long-term positive effects of preschool, it is not preschool, it is quality preschool. Look at the Tennessee study, where, if we really want our investment to have some payoff, we cannot completely go on the side of access and compromise quality. So personally, I think we have to put a lot of emphasis on raising quality. How do you do that? Now, this is going to sound counterintuitive. I think you have to raise the qualification requirements. It's counterintuitive because as soon as you do that, you're going to say, but where are these people going to come from? We already have a teacher shortage, and we don't pay them enough, and all you're going to do is exacerbate the problem. Well, yes, and maybe we have to exacerbate the problem. Maybe it has to get worse before it can get better. We have to have a long-term plan, like maybe it's a 10-year plan, so things kick in over time. So we've given higher ed a long ramp to build infrastructure, but we have to get people knowing that this is coming around the corner. You better start working on these issues. Increasing the quality requirements, to me, is going to drive salaries to some degree. And again, it's counterintuitive, but that's where I think a lever we have is. And the other area I think we've got to deal with is infant and toddler care. There it's both access and quality.
Yep. Beth or Marjorie, you want to add?
I mean, so she sort of said everything, right? Which, I think we can. I mean, that is the elephant in the room. We have a very broken system.
And then there's the reorganizing the whole system, and yeah.
So I think though she made some points around first. I'm not sure if I'm at the same place with the tension between compensation and qualifications, but I think we sort of have to recognize that I personally think they have to come together. So if you want to move on workforce, I think you have to move simultaneously on requiring more and then paying folks more. That's going to require pretty hefty investment. So it might then end up having to be sort of by age or by sector, which again is not something that we want to have to do. But it might be what's required to move the field forward as it relates to those two pieces. The other thing that I'll say, Patricia, because I don't know if you were asking as hard of a question as we took on, because you pointed out that you were saying pre-K to K alignment. So the thing that I think might help us make some initial progress there, aside from data, that I'm excited about, though it also makes me laugh, is the sort of new language around whole child approaches to K-12 education. And the reason that it makes me laugh a little bit is that if you've been in early childhood for a long time, you read things about whole child and you're like, this is like our framework. This is what we've been doing forever. We do it at varying degrees of exceptionalism, right? We're some folks are better at it than others. But the idea that all of the child is so key to their learning that they have to be fed to be able to learn, that they have to be healthy and have their shots to be able to learn, that they have to have a place to live to be able to learn. This is something that early childhood has really embraced for a long time. And so I see that framework and that new excitement in K-12 around the whole child framework as a leverage point to start conversations. I think that much of the reticence and the fear of push down from the K-12 into ECE has been around the lack of that kind of framework and that kind of thinking, or the perceived lack of that in K-12. And so that if you can use that as a conversation starter and we're all coming together with that same mission, that you can start to break down some of the barriers to collaboration, even if it doesn't actually do the collaboration part.
So we're coming up on time.
Oh.
Marjorie has one thing she wants to add, I think. Just one, though, right? And then we're
She
gonna
has like
close.
four things she'd like to add.
The one piece I want to pick up on something that Scott said earlier about the work they're doing in Condango with coaching of teachers, and I think that really focusing, like we can talk about requirements, should educators have a BA or not, and the time it'll take and what we need to do for higher ed to build up the infrastructure to train the teachers, but there's a lot of people working with our kids right now. And we also know a lot about adult learning and how to support the adults to better support the children. And it's not just going off to the workshops, go get your PD over there and come back and do better, but it's actually embedded in their jobs and looking at what they're doing and making it, providing them with good, high-quality feedback rather than slaps on the hand for what they're not doing. And so I just wanted to bring up again the point about the adult learning so that the adults can really support the children.
Yeah, excellent. Deborah
One
gets
last
the
thing,
last
which
word.
is, I think that it's like Sophie's choice when we have to choose. Well, what are we gonna do first? Perhaps what we should be thinking more is about. I was going to say a 10-year plan, but think of an 8-year plan, where we're working on all the issues that have been raised, but we're working in increments. So we set goals that are realistic for infant and toddler expansion of access. We set goals for improved training that have a long trajectory, but we're making some stepwise progress. We look at how these intersect and make sure that we're not doing something in year 2 that is actually going to undo what we did in another domain in year 1. So we're looking at the intersection. And in the meantime, the first thing we can do is advocate for people in Sacramento surrounding the governor and who are strong advocates of the kind of work that we all think is really important, to make sure that there's people there who are continuing to inform and listen to the field and get feedback from them.
So I want to thank the panel, but I also want to thank the people in this room because we've got this amazing foundation to work with, but if it's going to happen, it's because a lot of you all are going to make it happen. So thank yourselves. Thank the panel. And now I think we're headed down to the Magnolia Room again, right?